that makes so much sense to me, because that's same synonymous with addiction.
Yeah.
You know, when you put them in, now you're in a safe environment, here's your food, just show up. It like there, you can see the struggle
Yeah.
with them because of those reasons.
Yeah. Suddenly it's I mean, for lack of a better term, it's boring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you see the reverse. Like we've also seen people who are released from prison, and they're in a place where everybody's making all these
Yes.
decisions for them, and then they come into the real world and they're almost
Overwhelmed.
institutionalized
Yeah.
because they don't know how to redevelop those skills to
Yes.
make all those decisions. Life's hitting them too hard, or they
Yeah.
don't know how to handle it.
Yeah, they've hyper developed certain attributes in these very constrained environments, whether it be drug addiction or homelessness or prison life. Because again, you think about those environments; they are very constrained. You have to. There's a certain set of conditions and rules you have to follow every single day so that you just survive.
Yeah.
Normal life is not like that. We're always oh, by the way, combat's like that too. And this is why a lot of guys come back and they have PTSD. When you're overseas in combat, you are hyper focused on this environment, and you're so hyper aware of everything that can kill you at any moment. And so when you leave that, coming back from deployment to the regular world, the U.S., where you don't have to worry about any of that, it's a shock to the system, and that's where some guys have trouble turning that down. And I talk about, I don't know, I can't remember if I talk about it in the book, but even me coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, I'm super vigilant. I'm almost hyper vigilant, and that can be a detriment because my brain is constantly on. And so coming back, now I'm in New York City, and I'm looking at hands, I'm looking at people, I'm thinking about the person who's 10 feet behind me, I'm looking at dark alleyways, and I have to almost deliberately say, okay, stop, don't worry about that, let it go, because your brain's just on overdrive.
That is probably the best explanation of PTSD that I think
Yeah.
I've ever heard. I mean, obviously we all understand trauma, what you see, what you go through,
Mm-hmm.
all that kind of stuff, but this makes so much sense as far as just not being able to be in the moment.
Yeah.
and being stuck back there because you're trying to pay attention to all these things.
Yeah.
That's just life. That's
Yeah.
survival. You have to be
You
that
have to
way.
be, and so PTSD, I would say there's two elements. There's the PTSD of not being able to turn down your vigilance, and then there's the even more nefarious, dangerous PTSD of those environmental cues triggering negative events that you've experienced before. Which is, I mean, to this day, if I smell burning, mostly burning anything, maybe not just like pure burning wood, but burning in the atmosphere or burning trash or something, I immediately go back to Iraq because that's what it smelled like. And so there's things that trigger those moments, especially. I mean, because again, when we think about forging neural networks, when we learn something, there's a neural network that's forged, and that forging process takes place usually in a calm environment over some time. And then they get myelinated, and so those neural networks get really fast. So we can do them or we think them without thinking. There's not a lot of processing. One of the fastest ways to accelerate, one of the ways to accelerate learning, those neural network forging, are to have three factors: novelty, intensity, and focus. Right? When you have novelty, intensity, and focus, you are hyper accelerating those neural networks being forged. And so if you think about it, this is why when bad things happen, we remember them so much more viscerally, and we learn so much more viscerally than when good things happen. This is the difference between being told a stove is hot and touching a stove. Because if you're told a stove is hot, like, okay, maybe there's focus, but there's not that much intensity, and there's not that much novelty. You touch a stove, suddenly there's focus, intensity of heat, and novelty is like, oh my God, that was hot, right? So that's why it's forged. These experiences forge. And so when we talk about these super visceral experiences, whether it be combat, drug addiction, homelessness, divorce, I mean, anything traumatic in our lives, we are basically setting conditions to forge these neural networks and these triggers so that they're myelinated, and then later on down the line, and we might think we've forgotten them, but then something happens that clicks in that takes us right back, and we're feeling those emotions again. And that's really the root of the problem in helping people with PTSD. Is how do you help them detach themselves from those triggers to the degree that they can now look back and reflect on it positively. Because if those triggers still exist, if they still get you into an emotional state, it's impossible, almost impossible, to reflect appropriately or objectively if you have the emotion tied to it. And so that's the hard work of our social workers and psychologists and all the people who are helping everybody with PTSD, and it's not just, as you know, PTSD comes in many forms.
Yep.
Drug addicts have it,
Yep.
combat veterans have it, firefighters, cops, even a nasty divorce. There's PTSD can happen with any trauma, and it has to be recognized.
And I love that because, I'm a huge fan of long-term treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And, back in the day, our program used to be 9 months long. And then it was 6 months. And, insurance just will not pay for somebody to be in treatment that long, unfortunately. Yeah. So we've had to really modify things. But I was doing a lot of research, and it seemed like, and I want your opinion on this, 66 days of consistency creates a new habit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like that 66 days creates that myelin effect that would help alleviate a lot of that PTSD and that trauma, doing like a good thing that many days in a row to sort of establish new habits and routines?
I have to lean on Andrew Huberman again. When I talk to him about it, he will say that yes, it could be 66 days, it could be 33 days, it could be 15 days, it could be a moment. Right? Again, it all depends on this intensity, novelty, and focus. The more intense, the more novel, the more focus, the faster you're going to ingrain that. If you touch a stove and burn your hand, you won't touch a stove again. You won't go near a fire. You have learned that, and it's been extreme. And so I would say in a normal, calm conditions, normal life, hopefully we all have the normal life environments, doing something over and over for, I've heard 21 days, I've heard 23 days, I've heard 30 days, 60 days. Doing something over and over will condition that, will myelinate that circuit. But it's going to be very subjective to the person. And the key is, I want people to be careful with this when I say this, but the more novel and intense and focused you can make it, the faster it'll forge.
Oh, I love that because we're always trying to push people into CrossFit for
Yes,
those reasons.
right.
You want to feel good fast.
Mm-hmm.
This is the solution.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, I'm going to do the yoga. And there's a ton of benefits to the breathing and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like the people that will give the CrossFit a try, they tend to make that connection a lot faster.
Yeah.
Because of those reasons, because of the extremeness.
Well, and I would imagine you experience a lot of people who come to quit their addiction because of something they experienced. Maybe they had a friend who died and they watched it, right? And suddenly it's so visceral for them that something has to happen, something has to change. Those experiences also help. I know, people quit smoking because they watch their friend or their parent die of lung cancer. Like, I can't do this,
Yeah.
Or their child will ask them something about, like, hey, are you going to die because you're... it's all really about how that affects our system. And again, it's just why the brain is so fascinating.
And do you feel like something has to occur for somebody to want change? Something?
Well, so I will say yes, but I'll qualify that by saying we can initiate that. We don't have to wait for something. We can actually exercise our brains in a way that helps us get to that intensity. One of the, and I'm sure you've heard this technique, but I think it's called the Scrooge technique, where you have someone who wants to change behavior, and you basically have them think about and sometimes write down what their lives will look like in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, if they continue the behavior they're on.
We do it, play it forward.
There
Forward.
you go. And see and really get a feel of how horrible that could be. And then you do it in the reverse. Okay, what will happen if you change your behavior and you play that forward? Those types of emotional cues, that could be the change. This is there's a term for this in terms of, I think it's counterintuitive thinking or something like that, where you imagine the worst case scenario. It hasn't happened, nor might it might not even happen. But if you imagine it, and you can do that forward or backward. So in other words, you can say, okay, this is the case where you may pass an accident, and you say to yourself, oh my gosh, if I had been 1 minute earlier, I would have been that car, right? It's almost the what if. And normally, in most scenarios, I don't encourage the whole what ifs, because it's a lot. If it's not done effectively, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time and mental energy. But you can actually use those what if questions very effectively if you use them deliberately to create those scenarios that help create change.
I love that.
Yeah.
I have an interesting question. So I was reading your bio, and being from the Bay Area, huge 49er fan. I was very lucky at the Arete. There was Joe Montana there.
Yeah.
It just made my day. What work did you do with them to help them, like utilizing this stuff?
Well, the work I did with them was actually not this stuff.
Okay.
I did work when I got out of the Navy. I'm friends with Simon Sinek, who's a Start with Why author, a really
Love it.
fun guy and great friend. And as I got out of the Navy, he introduced me to a guy named Bob Chapman, who runs a company out of St. Louis. Well, they're all over the nation, but it's a manufacturing company. But he basically came up years ago with this idea of truly human leadership and human-centered leadership. And so they had a leadership institute. I went to work with them, and I was doing work with them and doing Simon's work. And it was really that work that the 49ers came in, and I helped give them in terms of leading with a human-centric leadership, building trust, and things like that. And they were just such great people to work with. We went to Levi several times to give them some training. So it was cool to see the stadium and stuff. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about the attributes as much, or it was just starting to kind of get in my brain in terms of what I could write about when I did that work with them. So
How long would you say was the duration of when it started to get in your brain to publishing?
Yeah. Gosh. Okay. So how could I? I mean, honestly, I'd been thinking about it for years since 2010 when I was running that selection for this specialized command. What happened was, interestingly enough, I had put it aside. I had thought about it a little bit. I got out of the Navy. I met Andrew Huberman. We started doing some work together on grit and moving through fear, and we've developed some protocols. We'll release that down the road, but some great stuff.
Oh.
We had started talking about writing a book together, and in that process, we recognized he was on the path of writing a solo project. We couldn't do a book together unless I did a solo until he finished his solo project. So he was like, hey, you should write your own book. And what's funny is the agent we got, she said, hey, just give me some ideas on what you can write about. I had been thinking about high performing teams forever, so I gave her like 2 pages on a bunch of high performing team stuff, and she got it. And she said, this is like 12 books. So if you were to pick one thing out of this, what would it be? And it was literally a one line, like one bullet point, attributes over skills. And I said, well, I could probably do something on attributes and skills because I had the stuff I'd worked with in the teams. And she said, okay, let's do that. And so as I thought about it, I said, okay, well, I can write about this distinction. Then I can just start writing about attributes and what they are and kind of go through these key attributes. So that was really the idea. And so that was about a year in development. And then when I started writing, the first 3 chapters were probably the longest, the hardest to do, just to lay it out because you have to introduce everything. Then I knew it was just about writing a chapter per attribute, and it went fairly quickly after that. I thought it was very fun. I mean, there were certainly times in any writer will say that you're looking at that blinking cursor on the blank page, and you're like, oh my God, what the hell am I going to say about accountability right now? So there was those times. But I mean, once you get rolling, and it helped me. Writing, I found, helped me dive even more deeply into my thinking on things, and that's why I like the process. So I love it. I will write another book. I have to get the attribute stuff, get the momentum going on that stuff. But yeah, I love the process.
That makes me very happy because that was the first question. Because it's the end of the quarter, I got to come up with a new book, and everybody's first question is, does Rich have a second book? I was gosh, that would make it so easy if you did.
I have the idea, but I need to flush out the idea a little bit and then get the attributes business, up and running. That's taking a majority of the time. But I'm really fascinated with what I call elemental human performance. What are those things that cause us to behave the way we do, especially during times of stress, challenge, uncertainty? Especially because people say that it's only in the rawest moments that the real us shows up, right? Well, I'm like, okay, who is the real us? Who is that person? Because it has oftentimes little to do with beliefs and values and personalities, right? And those elemental factors start, obviously, attributes, there's a low. And the next thing I think I'm going to write about is identity. Those identities that we stack on ourselves that drive our behaviors in ways that we actually don't recognize. And that's fascinating to me. So that's the idea. I'll flush it out and let you know.
I love that because again, I think because of how you wrote this book, you're going to have the science that backs that up, which will make it make sense for me and the people that all love your book so much.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to that.
It's again, I mean, I was it hit me because I thought about how powerful a Navy SEAL identity is, how powerful a Marine identity is, leaving the service and suddenly that identity is not there anymore. These and some people walk around, it's like, well, once a Marine, always a Marine, or the high school football team or that I played with, or the college I went to, I'm a Harley person, right? And suddenly I have all this stuff. It really keyed me in when I was watching this documentary on Flat Earth, the Flat Earth Society.
Oh.
And it's a really fascinating documentary called Behind the Curve. Now I don't want to presume, or anybody can believe whatever they want to believe. I happen to believe that that Earth is round, and I do so based on a lot of scientific evidence that is presented.
Yes.
In this show, they highlight and walk around with some members of the Flat Earth Society. You can see, and they do it very respectfully. You can kind of get a sense of their mentality and methodology. And during the show, they're on several occasions presented with very, very hard evidence, almost really undebatable evidence, right?
Yeah.
And there are, and again, that's people can think about that what they want. But what I noticed when I watched the show was a couple times when presented with this stuff, you saw these people, you almost saw a flash of understanding, a flash of light, kind of like a recognition. But then they dropped back in. And what I recognized, I said, what's happening here is these people, especially the ones they were profiling here, they've built their entire identity on this concept, right? And so to change their beliefs about it, they would literally have to throw away who they are. Yeah. And we as human beings, we do not like to do that. I mean, that is one of the most scary, challenging things human beings can do, is to take an identity we've built and a life around or whatever and put it aside. And so we do this. We stack identities throughout our lifetime. And the question is, how many identities have we stacked? Mm-hmm. And what rules are what rules and conditions of those identities are guiding our behavior without us knowing it? And then can we, in fact, strip those down to kind of the core ones, the ones that are very, very powerful. Here's an example. For me, obviously I was a Navy SEAL, but my primary identity was always husband and father, right? Mm-hmm. And then Navy SEAL. And I'm a true believer that we'll always serve first the identity that we prioritize first, right? So my behavior was always centered around husband, father. Now, the military does this all the time. They're like, nope, we don't care about that. Now your identity is you have to serve this one first. But it's still interesting to see how different people behave if Navy SEAL is first, and then maybe family is second, and then whatever is second, or whatever you pick it, or Harley guy is first, and then something else. That's fascinating to me, and that's what I'd like to explore.
I love that, and hopefully you have solutions. I know I actually went through that. I told you, when the pandemic started, my son was in the latter of his senior year, and I have a daughter who came before him, and so for 24 years, all I knew is mom. Even though I worked the whole time, CEO, boss, team member, former drug addict, all that kind of stuff, but the thing I most identified with that I always wanted to be since I was a little girl, it was mom.
Yeah.
And so I was almost in an identity crisis. Not even when he left. It was that whole year prior, like leading up to it.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, who am I going to be if I'm not this?
Yeah.
Which is stupid because obviously I'm always going to be a mom, whether he lives with me or not.
Yeah.
But I identified so much with it, I was almost grieving it before it even happened. And maybe that was good or bad because when he did finally leave, I was sort of like come to terms with it. I also started 75 Hard, so I started just distracting myself and finding out who I really was.
Yeah. Well, that is an example, a cool, pure example of how you can actually change the conditions around an identity very deliberately, right? And it's obvious that your conditions around that identity had to do with him living at home and you doing some mom stuff in that capacity. But yeah, any parent knows if you're a great parent, you're going to be a great parent whether they're living at home or whether they're with their own family.